Can we as a society look at some of these statues and say, actually, we're not particularly proud of that point in our history? We should perhaps either remove it and as a statement of what we believe.
Well, I would begin by answering your question by quoting what J. Gresham Machen said years ago in so many words: as bile is to digestion, so is knowledge to thinking. In other words, you cannot digest the food without the proper secretions and so forth. And what we have going on today, Josh, is this whole wave of protests and so forth, but there's no knowledge, there's no understanding, and folks are just whipped into a frenzy. And in the process, we see the very fabric that made this nation what it is being eroded. It's almost like pouring a solvent on it. In the end, well, the French Revolution said it pretty clearly. Who needs a lever to move the world when you have a match? You just burn it down and start over. And that never leads to a good end. And so, going back to your initial question, critical evaluation is necessary, and we condone that. We want folks to think for themselves and not just to parrot answers. Because this is what my history professor told me. Years ago, my wife was shopping with the three little boys, 5 and under, and they came around the corner in the store, and there was a fellow smoking a cigarette. And our 4-year-old, 5-year-old said, "Oh, look, mom," and she had to caution him, not to make a public scene and so forth. But he was already learning that smoking is not healthy, it's not a good thing, because his parents told him that. Now, as a 35-year-old lawyer, it would be downright foolish for him to say, "Oh, mom, look, he's smoking." We want him to know why he believes what he believes, not because his parents told him, not because a pastor told him, but because he's come to that conclusion based on his study and all. Now, there are certain foundations. For example, we start with the notion that there is a God who revealed himself in Scripture. And that Scripture is not up for debate. See, when you start saying, well, how do we know there really is a God? How do we know that he revealed himself in Scripture? And you get into higher criticism and all that that entails. And boy, that can pull you downstream very, very rapidly. So there are certain foundational principles with which we begin. And we don't pull any punches about this. Students in a Christian school setting, the parents should not be surprised that students are going to study history from a Christian perspective, that there is a God who providentially intervenes in the affairs of mankind. You made reference to British colonialism, and the whole Irish question is one that's open to a lot of criticism as to how the British handled that. It seems that the closer to home, the more mismanagement there was. In contrast to India, where the British invested many pounds. They built telegraph systems, hospitals. Missionaries came in, sometimes in front of the flag, and helped to do away with these terrible pagan practices like sati and thugi and so forth. And so today, the history texts are quick to jump on imperialism as if that's a terrible, terrible thing. Were there abuses? Absolutely. And we're not supporting the notion that we just do a dipsy doodle around those. We need to handle those tough passages in history. What about the treatment of the American Indians? That you cannot justify what Jackson, the Trail of Tears, and all. Um, you know, so we have to treat those things from a biblical perspective. I'm even reminded back in the Old Testament, some people read through those passages and say, "Wow, what a bloodthirsty God." He orders the Egyptians, excuse me, the Israelites to kill every man, woman, child, and beast. Well, look at the context. Those folks were so caught up in pagan idolatry. I mean, they were beating the drums there as they offered their newborn babes to Moloch with those outstretched arms, the belly heated red hot from the fire, and the screams of those children was being overpowered by the beating of the drums and all. And they had gone so far off course that God essentially said, "I've got to just bring judgment and start over." And I liken that to even perhaps what happened here with the Native Americans, as they're called today. And that is, there were hardships. Doesn't justify it, it's not right, but they too were caught up in terrible idolatry. The Aztecs offering 30,000 plus sacrificial sacrifices in one weekend alone. as they dedicated a new temple there in Tenochtitlan. And so there was a point where judgment had to come. So, having put that in perspective here, back to our basic question, we want our students to inquire. We want them, that's what the word history simply means, to inquire. And you go all the way back to the Greeks. And the idea here of Herodotus was to just go around and ask the Egyptians what their story was, ask the other people what their story was. So we're all for it. But what we're not, what I am speaking for myself personally, am not in favor of, is this carte blanche washing away all the past. I say, let's study history, warts and all. And even some of those statues that might be reprehensible are reminders. And they need to, if you just wipe them out, you say, well, we're just going to rewrite history to our liking. There are parts of history that we need to remember. The Holocaust was a terrible thing. And yet, in London, they're discussing whether or not to even teach that anymore with a Muslim mayor and so forth. So that's the historical revisionism I'm opposed to altogether. We need inquiry. We need folks to be able to think for themselves, but they've got to have the facts with which to think.
So, if I'm understanding you correctly, it's really the preservation of nuance and detail that is at risk when this process takes place. Would that be fair to say?
It starts there, but it actually expands, Josh, to the very principles and the underlying ideology. Historical revisionism is not just about losing some nuances and little interesting storylines. It becomes a seismic shift away from a God-centered view of interpretation of history, first to a man-centered view, and then ultimately it becomes almost a form of existentialism. You write your own history. And once we get to that position, Josh, we really are on dangerous ground.
Yeah, that's the road to that the postmodernist kind of mindset that's most of society seems to be based on these days. At least it seems to me. It's interesting when I said about nuance and detail. When we think of Robert E. Lee being the statue that caused a lot of this controversy, it would seem, at least from an outsider perspective, as someone who's British Irish, coming over here, it would seem like Robert E. Lee wouldn't be the most egregious example of someone who is someone a villain of American history. He would seem like someone who perhaps is one of the ones you could look at least on the Confederate side, and say this is a man that actually there's very little you can find objectionable about him. You would know more about that than I would, I'm sure, but that's at least what I've seen from studying it, at least briefly through the last year or so of teaching it. So I guess that's why when I said about nuance and detail, it's interesting that people tend to just throw out the baby with the bathwater, and that kind of leads me to my next question, which is,
can I comment on that just
yes,
as
absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Because you bring up such a cogent point, and that is, if someone's lifestyle is indicted by the testimony and by the life record of another individual, they're, everything else being equal, they're going to do everything in their power to try to assuage their own conscience, if they have one, by destroying that party. When Clinton was having all of his womanizing issues and all, the historians were saying, well, he's not the first. There's Jefferson and the whole storyline there, Sally Hemings. And I was actually taking a tour of Jefferson's place there, Monticello, and the guy was giving the regular spiel. And I pulled him aside after. I said, the DNA evidence shows that it could have been one of at least 6 individuals. And we know that Jefferson's brother was a dilettante. He was a woman's man kind of thing. So how are we so convinced that it has to be Jefferson himself? And yet that's what they want. They want to shake that tree. They just keep going down. So with Robert E. Lee, he freed his slaves. Grant had slaves, or his wife had a slave. And you go right down the list and see all of the things. Robert E. Lee had a pristine Christian testimony, just absolutely impeccable. Well, he has to go because he, I think, indicts the lifestyle of these people who are so anti-Christian. So you raise a valid point. He doesn't seem like an arch villain to someone who is objective in their study of history. But to these folks, he's the very epitome of everything that they hate.